Good morning, everyone. What a wonderful start to our 20th annual conference. And what a tough act to follow. I feel a little bit like a garage mechanic following Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart. My congratulations to Ron, Len, and Adi for your tremendous achievements, and my personal thanks for your inspiration over the years. Jim, that was a wonderful tribute, and all of our thanks to you for organizing this conference and kicking it off way back in 1991, and for your outstanding leadership over the years. Your contributions are why the Lifetime Achievement Award at the RSA Conference is named in your honor. Thank you, Jim Bitsos. We have indeed been fortunate to stand on the shoulders of giants. But it would be unlike us in this conference or as an industry to be too self-congratulatory or self-important. We know all too well that we're only as good as the last attack we have withstood. And let's face it, while we've relied on numerous giants over the years to create the success we've had, we've also had to navigate our way around a few pygmies. That's why I thought it might be interesting for the audience to hear this morning some of the titles and content from past presentations that turned out to be less than prescient, and occasionally, with 20/20 hindsight, downright comical. As I looked through our archives of photos and conference brochures, I have to say there was a wealth of material. When delivered, some concepts seemed to make intuitive sense, but they never achieved escape velocity and failed to reach ubiquity. Take smart cards, first mentioned in 1994. We were minimalists with our marketing brochures back then. By 1997, we were talking about incorporating PKI into smart cards. But we should have been nervous that same year, though, because we featured a track on how to break a smart card, only in this conference. By 2000, the handwriting was on the wall with, do PKIs even need smart cards? What's the next best thing? The abstract read, how can we secure the PKI if smart card readers don't materialize everywhere? Good point. How many in the audience have a smart card reader 11 years later? And although, as Jim said, we've been spectacularly successful implementing public key cryptography, embedded in SSL applications and hardware devices too numerous to mention, massive public key infrastructures were a different story. Let's take a look. Here's a graph of the number of track sessions offered on PKI by year. I think we seemed a little mired in the trough of disillusionment, wouldn't you say? A closer look will help us understand why. In 1999, we had our first warning that it might not all be heaven. PKI integration. It's not all or nothing. It was also that same year that Uncle Sam met the PKI. How's that HSPD-12 thing working out? I myself wasn't immune from the hype, serving in 2001 on that legendary panel, The Year of PKI. At least we hit the peak. I was on with John Ryan from Entrust, Fran Rooney from Baltimore Technologies, remember him? And Stratton Sklavos from VeriSign. The memories. But reality set in 2003 with, I have a PKI, now what? And the second coming of PKI that same year, followed in 2005 by the never say die cry, reinventing PKI. You know it's over when you have to reinvent it. Now, while smart cards and PKI never achieved the ubiquity we thought, they'll continue to play a major role in security, especially PKI in cloud computing. But there are also some of those What were people thinking moments? Can any of us forget the Clipper chip and key escrow? Yeah, neither one of those was funny at the time. How about 1995's public key and the US Postal Service? And proving that neither rain nor snow nor common sense could keep our Postal Service from its online rounds, they followed up with 1997's Postal Electronic Commerce Services. Fortunately for all of us, the world didn't go postal. Another few ideas whose time never came. 1996's encryption on the fly for Windows 95. Look at that Packard Bell monitor. And the memorable, listen to this, public key for single sign-on in distributed computing environments. A three-time loser if ever I saw one. We've also had a few Jerry Springer moments along the way. Who could forget the panel with Kevin Mitnick, seen here on the left, with, and in the middle with Chris Painter, his prosecutor, and on his right, his antagonist, Ira Winkler. I thought chairs were going to fly, and we were going to start hearing chants of, Ira, Ira. Now check out the photo behind Kevin. Look how it's peering menacingly at him. Now take a look at Ira. Who's scarier? Okay. Once, the RSA Conference organizers were even physically threatened for allowing Frank Abagnale to tell his story, Catch Me If You Can. We are nothing if not passionate in our loathing for our adversaries. And how about the time the father of the internet himself, Al Gore, was heckled and shouted at from the audience? And poor Al, a man of peace. And as competition to speak to this audience has intensified over the years, we've seen the abstracts get more outrageous in authors' attempts to get the committee's attention. Some are silly or clever, depending on your perspective. Cloudy with a chance of litigation. This year, What Happens in Vegas goes on YouTube. Queer Eye for the Chart Guy? And how about this? Papagino's secret sauce for next generation based hardware security. What are they putting on pizzas? You just couldn't make this stuff up. But wait, there's more. Some are violent. Zombie Trojans throwing spears. Sex, drugs, and cybercrime. Go flux yourself. UTM Smackdown. And die, script kiddies. Die, die, die. Some even have sexual overtones. The dirty little secret of IAM. The IT security industry, geeks gone wild. The case of promiscuous parameters. And my personal favorite, DoD gone wild, a look at the Horizontal Fusion Initiative. And finally, there have been countless now what's, best practices, and lessons learned. Each year, we have more than 2,000 talented, creative individuals vying for only 200 speaking slots. As I say every year, they are the backbone of this conference. All kidding aside, their content is illuminating, and we appreciate them all. Well, I hope you enjoyed that look back as much as I did. But to paraphrase the philosopher George Santayana, and this is a quote everybody I'm sure knows, those who do not study and understand the past will be condemned to relive it. And while I don't think we should take ourselves too seriously, we should also be very proud of what we have accomplished. Learning from our successes and failures, building on the rich heritage of our giants, we continue our important work with an eye to the future. Abraham Lincoln once said that the best thing about the future is that it comes only one day at a time. Having presented at this conference for over 10 years, I have the luxury of reflecting on the results of that daily progress each year in this keynote. With my colleagues, I do my best to craft a vision for our industry, using the privileged insight from so many of you to challenge us to jump ahead and intercept the future, to see things as they might be, not as they are. Reflecting on recent conference content and keynotes, we now recognize the limitations of perimeter defenses, and the need for information-centric security has become conventional wisdom. We now acknowledge that to be information-centric, security controls must be more intelligent, flexible, and dynamic. Thinking security. We now understand that security budgets are finite, and that to be cost-effective, security infrastructures must be grounded in a thorough understanding of risk, balancing the elimination of threats with materiality and probability. We now know all too well a criminal ecosystem has developed, and that nation-states and non-state actors like WikiLeaks pose new threats that can only be countered with our own cooperative ecosystem. That despite day-to-day competition, vendors must integrate technologies. Industries must share best practices and threat intelligence, and governments must cooperate with one another and with the private sector. And last year, the rallying cry from my keynote was safety in the cloud and a chance for a security do-over. So this year, my theme is trust in the cloud? I know what you're thinking. Is this going to be another series like the year of PKI? The answer is not really. There's a marked difference. Last year, my keynote was about the promise. This year, it's about the proof. The promise is that you can achieve safety in the cloud. The promise is that we can fundamentally do security differently and better. The proof comes when, by leveraging virtualization technology, we demonstrate better control and visibility, the key elements of trust in cloud environments. At this point, the IT industry believes in the potential of virtualization and cloud computing. IT organizations are transforming their infrastructures. We're well on our way to an era of applied IT, where investments will focus less on leveraging IT, less on spending money on infrastructure, and more on leveraging IT to solve business problems. But in any of these transformations, the goal is always the same for security: getting the right information to the right people over a trusted infrastructure in a system that can be governed and managed. But independent of this transformation to the cloud, we're seeing an enormous amount of change across the dimensions of information, identities, and infrastructure, creating a nightmare of control problems and visibility issues, the antithesis of trust. First, we have a tidal wave of information being created and more sensitive information being shared all the time. This creates significant information governance challenges regarding where sensitive data moves, who gets it, how it's protected at rest and in motion, and how, in a world of replication, we delete it, and on and on. Second, identities are proliferating. In addition to our traditional internal users, we have customers, partners, a growing number of mobile workers using consumer devices, and even machines accessing infrastructure and information. Everyone and everything needs access. Third, the entire IT stack is changing. We have a virtual layer now that abstracts the underlying storage, compute, and network infrastructure. Our boundaries become logical rather than physical. Our workloads now move so we can no longer depend on the physical infrastructure as a proxy for the information or process we are trying to protect. And as the endpoint splinters into 1,000 variation, the IT team is losing control and visibility over that too. And there are two other dimensions of change. Threats have shifted from viruses and malware to more advanced persistent threats that make static policies and signatures all but useless. The same is true for insider attacks. There's no antivirus signature for a crooked database administrator. Compliance also continues to evolve with more regulation, more changes within regulations, and greater reporting requirements. So, considering all these changes that have been created, it may at first seem that virtualization and cloud complicate the problem. It's certainly widely reported that confusion and fear are holding organizations back from adoption. But deliberately or not, organizations are already moving to the cloud in response to business demands. Fearful or not, these changes are making cloud adoption inevitable. Pardon another historical reference, but it reminds me of the time before Columbus, a world brimming with opportunity beyond the horizon, yet unexplored because of perceived dangers lurking past where the eye could see. And just as reaching the east by sailing west was counterintuitive, it may seem counterintuitive to use the technology enabling the cloud, virtualization, to secure the cloud. But we can. In other words, virtualization is our silver lining in the cloud. All right, penalize me 10 yards for the shameless use of a cliche. But if leveraged properly, virtualization can also be the pathway to surpassing the level of control and visibility that exists today in physical environments, transforming the infrastructure itself into a vital resource for improving security and compliance in three fundamentally different ways. First, security does become not only logical, but truly information-centric. In virtualized environments, static physical perimeters give way to dynamic logical boundaries defined by information and transactions themselves. Logical boundaries form the new perimeters for trust, and virtual machines adapt security to their particular payloads, carrying their policies and privileges with them as they travel across the cloud. Second, security becomes built-in and automated. In clouds, where information, VMs, and virtualized networks relocate in the blink of an eye, security measures must be just as dynamic. Achieving this means building security into virtualized components, and by extension, distributing security throughout the cloud. Also, automation will be absolutely essential to enabling security and compliance to work at the speed and scale of the cloud. Policies, regulations, and best practices will be codified into security management systems and enforced automatically, reducing the need for intervention by IT staff, a problem that is getting away from us today. And third, security becomes risk-based and adaptive because static security approaches can't address evolving threats. In the near future, trusted clouds will employ predictive analytics based on an understanding of normal states, user behaviors, and transaction patterns to spot high-risk events, anomalies, and allow organizations to proactively adopt defenses. While I've advocated for these principles in the past, we are now at an inflection point where they are being applied in solutions today that give us heightened levels of control and visibility. To make this tangible and to share the proof rather than just promises. Please welcome the Chief Development Officer and Co-President of VMware, Richard McAniff. Richard?
Thank you. Thank you, Art.
Thanks for joining me. Before we get into those proof points, I think the audience would like to hear VMware's perspective on this journey to the cloud that's underway.
Sure, Art. Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me and VMware here to join you today.
Well, you've got important things to say, so.
So great. Well, we've done a lot of research with our own customers and our customer base, and we really see three distinct phases of the virtualization journey. The first phase is where companies first discover virtualization, and they recognize the savings and efficiencies that they can gain from consolidating multiple physical servers to virtual servers. Now, often you see mission-critical or non-mission-critical workloads being moved to the virtualization environment during this phase. Once you get to about 30%, we see the drivers of virtualization begin to change. Resiliency becomes the key driver. And while consolidation is still very important, themes like uptime, high availability, backup, disaster recovery become really the drivers. In fact, one customer recently told me that he didn't care what the hardware consolidation ratios were. Even if he didn't save a penny, he would still virtualize. Because running virtual infrastructure helps with the robustness of your applications. And of course, being in a audience like today, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about security and how security really becomes a key driver as well during this phase of the journey. In fact, when I meet with customers, top CIOs, security is one of the critical issues on everyone's mind as we move towards the cloud. So getting back to the journey, if phase one is about CapEx, phase two is about resiliency, then phase three is really about agility. Terms like pay-as-you-go, self-service, elasticity, scale, multi-tenancy. These are the terms that you start to hear. And we call this phase of the journey to the cloud. If it's inside the firewall, it's a private cloud. If it's outside the firewall, we call this the public cloud. So CapEx, resiliency, and agility are the three main trends that are moving us along this journey.
Thanks, Richard. Let me follow up on that last phase. Do you agree, as I suggested earlier, that, that regardless of fear and uncertainty, that organizations are moving to the cloud anyway?
They are. You know, business owners are really demanding more. They want their IT partners to be more responsive to their business needs. More and more information, as you pointed out, is really becoming available. And people want access to that information immediately. They don't want to wait days or weeks for a machine to be provisioned. They don't want to wait days or weeks for an app to be provisioned. And I think we're all being conditioned to expect, you know, with a few mouse clicks, we can get the resources that we want. If I can download a new app to my iPhone or my iPad, I want this same type of service for my IT organization. And while we are just beginning to see infrastructure really developed as cloud resources, I think if you look at SaaS applications, they are really the first wave, and they're streaming into the enterprise. And these SaaS applications really represent, and I'll talk about this in a moment, a potential security threat. In fact, I'd like to challenge everyone to just write down how many SaaS applications you think you might have in your enterprise. Now, don't worry, this isn't a quiz. We're not going to grade you. But you may be surprised by how many you find. I know when I did this exercise myself, I certainly was surprised about how many we had in VMware. You know, SaaS applications in many ways remind me of what we saw back in the 80s when PCs flooded into the enterprise. And just as Windows PCs gave us tremendous productivity gains, They also cause a lot of problems that we're still cleaning up today.
You could say that again. So let's now specifically get at how virtualization changes security.
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of how virtualization really changes security in a fundamental way. If you think about it, security systems are really today built on the notion of a static infrastructure and applications that run on that static infrastructure. But virtual machines, by nature, are dynamic, adjusting to load, memory usage, storage, compute, and the SLA that's really defined by the application. Now, we call this elasticity, and it's in fact a very fundamental building block to what we call cloud infrastructure. Now, this also means that we need to really think about security in a fundamentally different way. The second thing that I think also you mentioned was that security is really built around the notion of pooled physical resources, IP addresses, port groups, names, and so on. And it becomes very, very difficult to translate business policy into security rules without writing thousands of them. And when you have this many security rules, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to automate them. And this is one of the key messages that Art, you just talked about. It's critical that we automate many of these security policies, especially in a world where we can migrate an app from one data center to the next in the speed of light. And the key to automation is to simplify these rules by translating business policy that connects applications and users rather than the physical hardware below it. We want to eliminate the need to translate business policy based on physical resources or physical machines. Lastly, the third piece that's really different is that clouds themselves are all about multi-tenancy, about shared infrastructure. You can no longer clamp a physical box onto a cable and protect that machine because you don't know where that machine is moving. When you're dealing with multi-tenant environments where applications can move around dynamically, as I mentioned before, you really need a different approach.
So with that as a backdrop, let's get to those proof points.
Sounds good.
I believe we have an illustration coming up, and we want to get our money's worth out of this telestrator here.
Now, with the football jokes that you made, so you're pretty good at this?
Yeah, well, I'm not quite John Madden, but I was better than you in the rehearsals.
You were. Okay, let's take a look at this. One of the three dimensions that Art talked about was really logical information-centric boundaries. And last year, VMware introduced a product called Vshield. And what's exciting about Vshield is it allows you to zone your infrastructure and apply policies across those zones. Let's take a look at what this might look like. We introduced another product last year called Vcloud Director. And Vcloud Director allows you to essentially define virtual data centers. Rather than a physical data center, you can carve up your physical data centers into multiple logical or virtual data centers. Let me go ahead and draw this. How am I doing, Art?
You're doing better.
All right.
You got to go a little faster, though.
All right.
We don't have all morning.
Speed of light.
Okay. Virtual technology moves faster.
So what these represent really are three different virtual data centers. So the first data center might be something like a test dev. Different SLA associated with a test dev environment. Thank you. The second one might be production, where you might have backup, recovery, tier 1 storage, and so on. So you want to be able to firewall each of these specific virtual data centers in a different way. You want to be able to put your firewalls directly at the logical level rather than the physical level. Now, within each of these virtual data centers, you may have multiple tenants accessing the information. For example, you might have a tenant that's PHI compliant, or you may have a tenant that's PCI compliant. And you want to make sure those tenants are actually separated from one another. And you want this software to discover those zones for you so that you can actually say, this might look like a HIPAA compliant zone that we have to protect. You want the software to help you there. And eventually you want to move these applications potentially from one environment to the next.
And the third one could be an external service provider. Right?
That's right. It could be your own private data center that's sitting somewhere else that you may want to move, but it may also be a public service provider that you want to move. And the critical thing is that what you want to do is you want to move the information with the application. You want to move those security rules. You don't want to have to reconfigure your entire network topology if you move an application.
Yeah, and you'd obviously you'd want to segment this off.
That's right.
As well.
You'd want to have this exactly the same.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Good.
So that truly is an intelligent infrastructure. And while we're making great strides heading to these dynamic and logical boundaries, we really also need a true ecosystem, do we not? As I was talking about, and you need to work with multiple security vendors and other infrastructure vendors?
We do. You know, last time I was here was at VMworld. We had over 17,000 people at Moscone. We did a conference in Copenhagen, had 6,000 people, and there were another 20,000 people that attended different vForums in Asia. And what I took away from that was really, this wasn't a VMware event, much like this is an RSA event. It's really an event that's an industry event. And it really is something that's happening. It's much bigger than what we are individually. It's not just RSA, it's not just VMware. This is something that's happening throughout the industry. And if we're going to work together to keep the bad guys out, as you mentioned, it's really important that we come together as an industry. And we're working with many of the top, of course, security. We're working with RSA, obviously. But we're also working with Intel to make sure that the core is protected. We're working with HP and Cisco in networking and VM security. We're working with Symantec and Trend on endpoint security. Now, I mentioned on endpoint security, it's very interesting because as you start to remove the AV software, for example, in the guest, and move it into a secure hypervisor or secure VM, it becomes a lot more safe, as well as more efficient and performant and so on. So we're working with people across the industry to really make you know, security really change, and we need a lot of help from everyone.
Great.
Now, one of the big elements about all this is, of course, automation and management. I know that you introduced quite a few products recently. You might want to tell us all about what you're doing.
Thought you'd never ask. So back to the Telestrator. This past summer at VMworld, we announced our solution for cloud compliance. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, we developed 130 security controls for the virtual infrastructure using VMware's hardening guide. We then mapped those controls to a comprehensive database of regulations and security frameworks that reside in the RSA Archer GRC platform. An example of this might be something like the PCI standard. Now, Archer routinely discovers the status of controls at this control management layer. In this particular instance, if I get my Telestrator right, we are able to see the compliance performance of vSphere as exposed through vCenter all the way up to Archer, where it's read, interpreted, and reported on. Now, we also intend over time to expand what we're looking at this control management layer to other security vendors, like McAfee's, for instance, ePolicy Orchestrator. And finally, we've embedded the matrix of controls from the Cloud Security Alliance into Archer as well. This will allow us to measure cloud service providers' compliance against benchmarks created by the industry. And these solutions will simplify the process of creating and maintaining secure and compliant clouds.
But how about risk and adaptive-based approaches? We have a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, we have a fair bit of work to do there is true. And it is one of those fundamental ways that we have to change security. But we're already adapting our risk-based authentication for detecting fraudulent users inside virtual cloud environments. And don't forget, you know, DLP is going to be a great tool here. We're using it to discover and classify information. And over time, by policy, we'll be able to adapt the application of specific controls to facts and circumstances.
That's great.
Yep, I'm sorry?
No, I said that's great.
Yeah, it is great. And what, I was on a roll. You know, and in addition, we have elements of our risk engine and behavior analytics that we're going to apply not just to identities over time, but to information and devices. And while these aren't proof points this year, we're going to need to have something to talk about next year, right?
We always do.
But Richard, I'd like to get back to those SaaS applications. You were referring to the potential for a security hole there. Let's talk a bit more about that.
Well, you know, I think, as I mentioned, these SaaS applications are really becoming more and more viral within the enterprise. Paul Moritz, our CEO, at VMworld talked about how many SaaS applications we had at VMware. And he mentioned that there were around 15. And he joked about the fact that he hadn't authorized any of them. And I did a check last week, and it turns out we have 29 now. Think about that for a moment. 29. They're sort of coming in from everywhere. You know, I think it probably first means that companies have multiple passwords floating around that aren't tied into their internal infrastructure. You know, if you use Active Directory, for example, it's very unlikely that they're tied into AD. Now, here's a couple of the problems. Aside from the fact that you may have lots of passwords around that you don't know about, you're also probably putting mission-critical application into these environments, into these clouds. Now, putting data into the cloud isn't the problem. The problem is not knowing what you're putting into the cloud. And closely related to this is that if an employee leaves the company, and if you don't know that you have to deprovision that person because you don't control their password, the SaaS provider controls the password, then you still leave this user with access to the information. So another issue that's not completely related to security is around management. You don't know how many licenses you have and how you're paying for it. So at VMware, we're working on a project to solve some of these problems. We talked about this last year at VMworld. We have a project called Project Horizon. It's a development effort with the mission of delivering simple, secure, end-user access to applications and data across a wide variety of devices. And Project Horizon will broker user access to applications, virtual desktops, and data resources while preserving the required level of security and control required by the CIO. We think it's a big breakthrough, and we're excited to be working also with RSA on the new Cloud Trust Authority that I think you're going to talk about right now.
That's right. When organizations leverage cloud services, they operate under a promise of security and compliance rather than proof. But that must change to truly enable trust in the cloud. But the challenge isn't simply providing visibility and control just once, but doing so across multiple SaaS, PaaS, and infrastructure as a service cloud providers. So it would be useful to achieve control and visibility without having to implement multiple point-to-point integrations to achieve that goal, which is why we're introducing the RSA Cloud Trust Authority. Provided as a set of cloud services, the Cloud Trust Authority leverages technology from VMware and RSA and will provide visibility and control over all dimensions: identity, information, and infrastructure. Now, to meet the requirements of so many providers and customers, this also means we will have to build up a bigger ecosystem of security and infrastructure partners, starting with yourselves, but including Cisco, Intel, Citrix, and others. The first version will go into beta in the second half of this year, where we'll enable a series of identity and compliance services. The Cloud Trust Authority is going to be important not simply because of the services it provides, but in how it will enable an effective ecosystem of trust between enterprises themselves and the service providers that they contract with.
Oh, that sounds great, Art. And thanks so much for allowing me to come up and speak. I think we've given the audience a lot to think about, and it's been a lot of fun joining you today.
Well, I appreciate you coming on stage, and I hope you come back next year and have your own keynote.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's great to have the leader in virtualization present to this audience. So again, my thanks to Richard McAniff.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
I'll have the conference send them the bill for next year's keynote slot. So, trust in the cloud. It is achievable, not just in some distant future, but as these proof points demonstrate today. We're well on our way. And you may wonder if, upon reflection, 20 years from now, these ideas will stand the RSA Conference retrospective test of time. I think it's clear from the trends we're seeing in IT in the marketplace that virtualization and cloud will shape the evolution of security dramatically and positively in the years to come. I look forward to watching that evolution unfold and hope the coming years also provide some entertaining material for the next 20-year review, whoever gets to deliver it. No, not him. Why not? Thank you very much. Have a great conference.